Well, the most exciting part of this work is the opportunity to work with, leaders, and we have some of the smartest practitioners and leaders in our community that's going to come on the stage right now to really, again, talk about these tough issues, talk about how do we begin to think about implementing the strategies that you guys just heard. So I'm going to call them out one by one, and we're going to start off with the President and CEO of Bridging the Gap Development, Derek Tillman. Next, we have actually a critical long-term supporter and ally to Neighborhood Allies, the Senior Vice President of the Pittsburgh Foundation, Jeannie Perlman. Next, we have the Honorable City Councilman, City of Pittsburgh, Council District 6, Daniel Lavelle. Next, we have the Executive Director of the Latino Family Center, Rosa Maria Cristello. A dear friend to all of us, the Executive Director of the Kelly Strayhorn Theater, Janera Solomon. The President and CEO of the Randall Chemical Manufacturing Company, Greg Spencer. And last but certainly not least, the President and CEO of the Hill CDC, Marimba Malayans. Well, all right. We got some sharp people up here on the stage. Ready to get to work? All right. Well, obviously, we're going to cover a lot of information this morning, and so we're just going to try to keep it tight, keep it sharp. We don't want to go over too far, so we're going to kind of just jump in with Derek. We're going to start off with Derek, and you're familiar with the report. You're on the ground every day as a developer, and you're working in the communities that we all care about and that we're all trying to impact. So as it relates to inclusive development, can you give us an example of what you see as an inclusive development project?
Sure, absolutely. So as I think about this question, I kind of have to reflect first on my life because answering it really comes a lot from my personal experience. I always tell the story when I graduated from college, I couldn't find a job. And I was very frustrated because I felt like I had did everything I was told to do, went to school, got good grades, networked, got internships, even got a non-traditional degree in information science. But when it came to being given an opportunity, I was being passed up. While I was in a great program called Coro Center for Civic Leadership, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, I met this young man in the middle, Greg Spencer, and I reached out to him just to really talk about my frustration of not being able to find a job, and he said, you know what, I'm gonna help you. So he set up some mock interviews with some of his colleagues to really see if there was something I was doing wrong in these interviews and to see if there was a way that maybe a connection could be made. I met some great people, but ultimately I was still unemployed at the end of it. Mm-hmm. So he allowed me to come work for him. So my first opportunity out of school was working for him. And I always look at that as really the springboard for everything that I'm doing today in development. And I give that example because the example I'm about to give of a project really encapsulates the opportunity that he gave me. So right now we're working on we just were awarded low-income housing tax credits for a 36-unit new construction project in the Hill District. And what we wanted to do is really, as has been talked about throughout this conference, is raise the bar on development. So we started with raising the bar on design, really designing affordable housing to look like market rate. But beyond that, raising the bar on construction. So we have an awesome building. Then we reached out to the Energy Innovation Center to partner to do a customized training program to really prepare our residents, going beyond the building, but how can we also build up the people? to prepare our residents for a 21st century job. So we designed a customized training program, soft skills, financial literacy. Just was able to form a collaboration with Coro, so they'll also be doing a training similar that they did for me, for the residents.
Absolutely.
So we have this awesome training program. Then, finally, I went out and I recruited 36 employers to line up job opportunities for each one of our 36 residents. So what have we done? We are creating an awesome building, a great customized training program that's culturally relevant to our residents, and we're also paired that with a job. So I look at that same opportunity that Greg gave me as being able to give to these residents. So it really connects it, and that's what I see as a inclusive, equitable development project.
Wow, that's incredible, Derek. It's incredible. Just a very brief follow-up question, because we work with a lot of developers, and I've worked with developers for years, and we know there's a cost, to putting that extra, effort in and the training programs, et cetera. How do you overcome those challenges of just basically the additional cost?
Sure. So we were able to build into our budget costs for supportive services. And that's really how we approached it. How can we implement and incorporate a robust training program? And, in this case, with the 9% tax credits, we were able to kind of build that into our overall cost.
So I think a key to that point is it is really a matter of prioritizing the resources.
Right.
Maybe there's a little less, just slightly less profit, but prioritizing the resources, you can get it done. So that's very inspiring, man.
Absolutely.
So we're going to go to Rosa Maria as the executive director of the Latino Family Center, and you guys work obviously with the growing Latino community in Pittsburgh. Talk a little bit about, real briefly, how do you build the bridges to the immigrant and Latino community and the Black community, and how is progress being made?
So to be quite frank, building relationships between the immigrant community and the African American community, that's actually something that is just bubbling up right now. And the reason is because Pittsburgh didn't see necessarily the rise of or the influx of immigrant groups until now, more recently. And so for the longest time, immigrant groups have had to kind of come together, and the conversation has been more of a message as, hey, Pittsburgh, we're here, like raising our hand, we're here. And so I'm hopeful that that's come across now. And so now the conversation is, how can we partner, how can we collaborate with now all groups here in Pittsburgh? And I think where we're at right now is simply raising awareness of what are the similar challenges that we have and the differences, right? And so finding common ground. A lot of immigrant leaders have been trying to focus on that. How do we find common ground with our neighbors here and support each other in that? While also raising awareness that the language barrier is not something that is minimal. It's actually a really big hill, mountain that we have to climb. And the response that we have gotten from our neighbors here in Pittsburgh is first like, wow, we had no idea. And then the second response is, how can we help you? So I would say that that's where we're at right now in the innovating and finding solutions to work together.
Just a quick, brief follow-up question. I know it was mentioned yesterday many times about creating a welcoming community. How do we create, what are the small steps, for now that we can do to create a more welcoming community for the Latino and the immigrant population?
So there's several ways to answer that question. But at the end of the day, it actually goes back to what you were saying. I think it's connected to hiring. So we need to see more within the Latino community. We need to see more Spanish-speaking individuals being hired at all levels of an organization and in all systems, hospitals, schools, everywhere. We need to, the community needs to see itself in the places that they go. And then just, we were talking about this earlier, not necessarily putting us in silos, right? But making sure that there's more an infusion of immigrant groups working with Steeler fans. I mean, there's so many things that we have in common. So
Absolutely.
Not necessarily putting us in silos, but finding ways that we can actually work together.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Marimba. I know this is near and dear to your heart. You spent your life, this is your life's passion, your life's work. But I want to ask you, what does successful equitable development look like in your community?
In our community, the Hill District, which is located in the heart of Pittsburgh, right between downtown and the University of Pittsburgh or University District of Oakland, which is also where CMU is located, I would say, which means that it's strategically located for those of you who may not work in bricks and mortar community development every day, strategically located for economic development and for connections to broader markets. What community development that is equitable looks like to me is community-centered planning, and the Hill District came together several years ago to establish a Greater Hill District Master Plan, which deals with a broad span of, human-centered issues, arts, education, brick and mortar, everything. And so that's the first step. And making sure that that process is inclusive, including residents, leaders, preferably government, preferably the philanthropic community if there is one, so that it can be tied not just to the people but to the capital for implementation. And then I'd say that having a community level review of development coming into the community is critical. And we have been fortunate to implement what we call the Development Review Panel, which is a table of residents who review developments that are coming into the community. Derek's project did successfully go through that process. So congratulations again, Derek. But what that does is it takes development from being completely downtown centered and really brings it into the community so that the residents, one, can notify other residents about what's happening, but also so that we can align the development with our master plan. And I'd say three, developers need to do what they say they're going to do. And I realize that there aren't endless dollars to implement development projects, but Derek's project is an example of how resources can be allocated differently, but still a successful development can be reached. And I think, of course, equitable development cannot be done without policy that supports communities. And I think that that's one of our biggest challenges is the ongoing policy advocacy that's required to do this work. It takes a pound of flesh out of you.
Right.
And so it makes it difficult to do some of that tactical implementation work from time to time because you may have an overarching policy that may undermine your ultimate goal of, comprehensive and equitable development.
Fantastic. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Jeannie. Obviously, the Pittsburgh Foundation has been a tremendous supporter of not only neighborhood allies, many of you in the room, and I know a lot of these issues are near and dear to the Pittsburgh Foundation. You've recently launched the 100% Pittsburgh, and it certainly has an eye toward alleviating poverty. But I'd like to get some feedback from you in terms of how this aligns, the equitable development work and the strategies being recommended aligns with the Pittsburgh Foundation and the 100% Pittsburgh agenda.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Well, I work for the Community Foundation. I actually have probably the best job in the world, although my colleagues might argue that they do. But I give away money for a living, so it's kind of a perfect world. But 2.5 years ago, we looked at our 70-year-old community foundation with over 2,000 individual funds, about half of those with living donors. And we began to wonder, how can we have an impact? And out of that came an organizing principle we call 100% Pittsburgh. Our president and CEO, Max King, does this so much better than I do, but it means essentially that 30% of our families, our friends, our neighbors are not able to take full advantage of this new prosperity that we see here in the community. And that's just wrong. And so as we tried to figure out what role a community foundation might have, we began with, well, what do we believe in? And we identified 3 values that are part of our work. The first is equity, which we define as racial equity. It means to us, resources follow need. We identified voice, and I was so happy to see voice in the report as well. It means that we ask, we don't tell. It means that the greatest source of wisdom about what the context is that causes poverty comes from the people with lived experience. We are not experts. We jettison the idea that just because we work for a foundation or that we have privilege means we know everything, because we do not. And the third is courage, a value that has been part of the Pittsburgh Foundation profile for a long time. We like to be first money in, we like to take a chance, we like to work with leaders in the community. But these 3 things together, racial equity, voice, and courage, are now framing everything we do. And what that means in practical matters, in this wonderful city where we have so much philanthropy, we are so fortunate to be here, but we're kind of small and nimble compared to some of our larger colleagues. So we really don't have the resources to do the kind of bricks and mortar work that many of my colleagues here do. But what we can do is invest in systems change, invest in grassroots leadership, and we can operate, if I may say, with humility. I have learned humility. I have to keep learning it every day, so I don't know what that means. But to understand how much courage it takes for a mother and a father trying to raise a family on what cannot be described in any way but an obscene amount of money that constitutes the poverty level from a federal standpoint. Their courage to show up every day and do the best they can is humbling for me. We operate in a community where people are still willing to come out, speak the truth to power, and fight for what's right. And that's what I do every day.
Wow, wow, that's great. And you mentioned this, but in terms of the philanthropic community as a whole in Pittsburgh, what do you think needs to change for the sector to advance equity and inclusion at a larger scale?
Well, speaking of telling the truth, the first thing we did when Max King came, and this actually had begun when Grant Oliphant, who's now, of course, with the Heinz Endowments, but he was at the Pittsburgh Foundation. I think young people talk about walking the talk. Is that right? And so we had been talking about structural racism and equity for a long time. But maybe we thought it was time to get our own house in order. What credibility do I have going out to communities and organizations when you might look at the staff that we have at the Pittsburgh Foundation and ask, do you look like the community you serve? And I think the foundation community has to do that as well. I think it's time to say that the voices and the talents and the skills of people who go out and work every day on these issues, we need to bring them in the door. I think the other thing that is important to ask about ourselves as philanthropies, how hard is it to get a grant from the Pittsburgh Foundation? It's an interesting question. It should be fairly simple, right? We started a program this year called Small and Mighty. And it was designed specifically for organizations that had never received a grant. And we figured, well, what could be the barriers? So we asked. Well, to begin with, our questions are ridiculous. The paperwork you have to fill out is a burden. Nobody ever talks to me, we heard. All they do is hand me a form to fill out. So for this grants program, we just threw all that stuff out. And we got 47 brand new applications of grassroots organizations meeting the basic needs of vulnerable populations in our community. And as we were reviewing these grants, we looked at each other, and the word that comes to mind is shame. We were ashamed that this was what it took. We are going to knock those walls down. Now, I work for the Community Foundation. My colleagues are noble and engaged in the battle, but we each have to do that self-examination. Are we serving the people we were created to serve?
Great, great. Councilman Lavelle, you've certainly been a champion around affordable housing and inclusion for many years now. Again, it's an honor to have you on the stage with us. Two-pronged question for you. On the policy level, what do you think is moving forward already? But also in terms of policies, what policies do you think would have the most impact but would be the most difficult to implement?
Okay. So what's already on the table, as most people in this room are probably already aware, is the whole conversation around affordable housing. Currently, before City Council is legislation to create an affordable housing trust fund. There'll be tweaks to the legislation as presented, but I believe that will pass. The real conversation then begins on now, how do you fund this? How do you come up with the $10 million to actually invest to be able to do this? Which brings to your second question, which I'm gonna answer slightly differently. Because it's not as much policy, but it is a will, and to use your word, a courage that we are collectively going to have. Because when I think of what it means to have equitable development, I think of this cartoon that I'm sure most people here have seen with the little kids trying to look over the fence for the baseball game, which means the reality is community of color in the city of Pittsburgh, comparing it to that cartoon, are going to need the biggest block, right? To be able to look over the highest, which means they're going to need the most amount of resources. And when we start talking about resources, we're really talking about dollars and cents. And that literally means the city, authorities, foundations, and others are going to do that self-examination and really say, are we putting the most resources into the communities of the most need to produce the best levels of development? And that's going to be a tough conversation and a very real one that has to occur. I think it's great, all of what's being said, but then it comes down to the nuts and bolts of this, and which is a lot of what I'm focused in on. I've said for some time now to my colleagues on council, if we're really trying to change this city, if you have 10 communities and you got $10, it's not enough to say now all of a sudden every community is going to get $1, right? Because certain communities have only been getting a penny for years. Others have gotten 5 cents, while others have been getting 5. And that dynamic has to change, and we have to begin intentionally, disproportionately allocating resources. And I think that's actually going to be the biggest challenge in front of us, to make sure that when you start talking about development, a young gentleman like Mr. Tillman, who I don't believe he spoke about his MWE numbers on his project, which are higher than normal, but to be able to say, we're going to now make sure he's getting the development deal, as opposed to the big-time developers that historically do it but aren't willing to go the distance as he's willing to go, and that'll be a huge political fight.
Wow. Amen to that. And I believe if I recall correctly, Derek, your project was put through the P4 metrics and went through off the charts. So
yeah, it was said that our community impact was off the Richter scale. So yes.
It's great. So we can all follow. Janera, arts and culture is so important to the aesthetics of our community, the identity of our community. You've been involved in this area for a long time. How do you view the relationship between art and culture and equitable development, and how can we also strengthen that relationship?
Thank you. So first, I think I'll say, you know, Jeannie and I would have to have a fight for who has the best job. Because I feel incredibly honored to have the opportunity to work with people who have the courage to bring ideas forward and the commitment and the conviction to produce them. It's one thing to say, oh, I would like to create a poetry forum, or I'd like to write a book, or I'd like to write a play. Lots of people say they'd like to do lots of things, but to actually pull together the resources and pull yourself together to persevere and do it, that takes a lot of courage. And those are the folks that I get to work with every day. And the opportunity to work with people who are inspired is incredibly, I don't know, I think it might be a little bit better than what you're doing. So I'll say that. So, you know, art, I struggled, Rosa Maria and I were talking before this, I struggled with the question of arts and equitable development. You know, when I first saw the equity plan and I participated in some of the sessions, I loved all of the ideas, but I was concerned that there were just 2 bullet points connected to art, or even use the word art, and one around education. So I wrote to Presley and Shad and others, and they said, I'm concerned about this. Art is not, yes, it is about aesthetics, of course. You know, we all look beautiful here. Someone designed our shoes and our bow tie and our scarves, and you know, beauty is important to who we are and to making our world what we'd like it to be. But for me, in terms of equitable development, to Marimba's point about community and values and listening to what communities have to say, art in its broadest sense and cultural expression in its broadest sense creates a platform for people to share, not only share their values, but to understand them, to critique them, to become clearer about who they are and what they're about. And so for me, if we're going to be about equitable development, we kind of have to think of, you know, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs triangle. We have to turn that upside down. You know, we say, well, once we have the basic needs met, housing, jobs, schooling, perhaps, then we'll talk about art. Then we'll talk to people about how they feel and what they're proud of and what they care about and what they're fearful of. And I would say that if we were to start the conversation the other way, if we were to start with, who are you? Why do you matter? What do you care about? What makes you feel valued? Then those other conversations would probably be a lot better, and we'd be making progress and not have so many plans on top of plans.
So that's great. Absolutely. I'd like to just ask to follow up 1 or 2 strategies that you think are missing or that we can introduce to what we've been talking about to promote, you know, the art and culture and really, as you mentioned, the identity and the expression of our neighborhoods. What are a couple of strategies, you know, bullet point for me that we can do?
So I think there are actually several great things happening here in Pittsburgh, and to what Angela Blanchard said yesterday, we've got to recognize and celebrate them. You know, creative placemaking and now creative placekeeping are very popular concepts all across the country. But we in Pittsburgh, we've been placemaking and keeping for a very long time. I think the mistake we've made, and we can point to some neighborhoods, Southside, Lawrenceville, a couple of others, where economically they're revitalized, they're awesome. We like to go there, we like to be there. But the question of what's the culture of the place,
right.
I think we would have a lot of debate about what's there. So I'd say for now, we have a moment. We have a moment in several communities, East Liberty and along the Penn Avenue corridor is one of them, where we can pause and say, okay, we've made incredible progress in economic development, and let's take a look at the social and cultural fabric of the community and how might we put some energy there. So I think, you know, what's happening along the corridor on Penn Avenue is a great example of what's going right and a strategy for us to take a look at. and see what we can learn from.
Yeah. In my view, I think I totally agree, and I think building in the art and culture conversation earlier in the process.
And I want to sorry to cut.
I think it's critical. No, please.
I want to add one more thing, because people say that and then they do something that's really wrong. So, yes, art and culture in the process earlier on. The one thing that I want to encourage people to remember is that we're not talking about importing art into communities. I once heard one of my colleagues say, as they were launching a project in a neighborhood, I think it was Homewood, where the person said, we're so excited to be going into Homewood. We're going to be bringing art there. Art hasn't been there for such a long time. And I looked at them like, are you Christopher Columbus? Did you just land here? So I think, yes, bring artists. Artists are citizens. They're active. They're engaged citizens. Include them in the process. Ask them to be part of the process. Don't only ask them to design your report or come in after the fact. But remember that there is art there. As Majestic said yesterday, there's a there.
Beautiful. Got it. Thank you. Greg, I certainly, your background certainly resonates with me, someone also coming from I spent 20 years in the corporate sector in banking, so this idea of, merging the two worlds, the for-profit and the nonprofit is exciting. So I'd like to ask you, what role do you think the private sector should play in advancing this agenda, and why it's important to the private sector?
Thank you. I hate to be the last, but that's okay. And Derek loves embarrassing me. I came home, and I'm also one that like to talk about my personal experiences. I came home from the Air Force during the Vietnam War, towards the end, and I came home, and I was a college dropout. I made some not so smart decisions, but I was hired as a laborer at a U.S. steel plant. But I had the ability to type 60 words a minute. And when they had a position up in the personnel department, I got it. And I remember that experience, and I remember the experience in the warehouse when people wouldn't have lunch with me because of my color of my skin. Some number of years later, I became the general manager of human resources for U.S. Steel, and I was responsible for everything except labor relations and executive compensation. And I look back over that, I recognized that the corporation invested in me, right? And they got a return. When I left U.S. Steel and went to Equitable, now known as EQT, the further development took place. And we were successful as a company, and I was successful. And then I recognized at some point that the Lord had a different vision for me. And so as a result of that, I started a business. I was tired of people saying that African Americans couldn't run a company. And my interest is always, I'll demonstrate that you're wrong. And so the goal of the company is to hire people and give them a second chance. And I'm proud of what Derek's done. And there are more Dereks. So I look at what can the private company do? There are phenomenal resources, financial and human. If we would intentionally develop people with the understanding that they clearly can. And someone could very easily, and I probably was one that said he'll never make it, he won't do anything. He has a speech impediment, he has a reading challenge, but they invested. And I think that's what the private company needs to do. Invest, and believe you me, they'll get a return.
Wow, excellent. Yes, sir. Also coming from the private sector, I recognize the intentional focus from the private sector on shareholder value, shareholder return. That is the key. We talk about this a lot. That is the key role of the CEO. Why is this important to that shareholder value, that shareholder return to a company?
I appreciate that. So another personal reference. It occurred within the last 2 or 3 weeks. I serve on a board of an organization that was making a presentation at a board meeting for a capital project that was going to be over $42 million. And at the board meeting, I asked a question about minority participation. And as you can suspect, I was the only African-American there. Surely was the only one to raise that question. So I didn't get the kind of answer that I wanted. But after the meeting, I went to the person who chairs the facilities committee, and I said, I've been on this board for a while, and I believe that we need to begin to make sure that we invest overall, not only in the mission of what we do, but also the community. And he looked at me and he shook his head. So this week, we had a special board meeting, and the intent and purpose of the meeting was to ask for approval to move forward. And fortunately, it was a conference call. And so when the question came up about the bidder, I said, well, where will we be on minority participation, contractor participation? And he responded, we're working now with the law department to put language into the contract about minority participation and attainment of goals. And I'm glad I was a conference call, because I went, yes! I think as people move it through corporations, as you know, you need to be in the room. If you're not in the room, if I wasn't in the room, I couldn't ask the question. And when policies are being made, if we're not in the room, we have no influence. And I think that, and I do believe that companies' return on investment are the people that walk through the door every day. And some of them look like me, and some of them look like others, and some probably you don't know what they look like. But they'll always tell you the most important investment are in their people. And I think we need to make them live up to that.
Very good. Very good. Outstanding. So as we begin to wind down, I want to throw a question out sort of to the panel, and I really would like Councilman Lavelle to answer it first. And that is, again, in your role as a tremendous city leader, involving policy and advancing capital, why is equitable development so important to Pittsburgh right now? What is at stake?
The future of our city is dependent on it. To combine that question with what you just asked, Mr. Spencer, if we don't invest in communities of color, if we don't invest in the least of us, this community will not make it long term. That's, in my opinion, a reality. We are among the oldest, whitest cities in the country. Our minority population is among the poorest. That is not a recipe for success. Despite all the accolades, we still lost population last year. Despite all the accolades, we are still having a brain drain within the African-American community. And so if you're not willing to say, I need to put the resources to ensure that the #1 entrepreneur in this country, which are women of color, to ensure that the #1 individual going to college, which is African-American woman, are invested in or staying in the city, this city will not make it. This is in our, to your sort of question, what's the return on investment? This is in our economic best interest. If you want me to be able to pave some more streets next year, then I need the communities of color to have more jobs. I believe I just read a report last week where it said our workforce is like 85% white. That's a recipe for disaster. When you look at any metrics of where young people want to move, they want to move to diverse cities. That's always sort of in the top 5. That's a problem here. So this, the whole, and the P4, and I focus strictly on the people part. If we're not doing that, if we're not changing a reality where the communities of color are most impoverished in the country and creating a new wealth legacy for them and doing it through development, then ultimately our city will not make it.
All right. Marimba.
And I think that in addition to that, Councilman, which I think was articulated very well, your points, we will not be able to retain or attract diverse professionals without redeveloping our communities of color. I mean, that is just the bottom line. And so what happens in Pittsburgh in many cases is when we attract minority professionals, they are told don't live in the communities that start with an H, right? That's the Hill District, Homewood, Hazelwood. They probably throw in a couple of others. And then those professionals move out to communities like Cranberry, to Monroeville, and other neighborhoods, and then they wonder why they're gone in 4 years, if not 2. And it's because there's no connection. There's no cultural connection. There's no community connection other than maybe Sunday at church or when they go get their hair done. And so if we are not able to understand the direct connection between retaining the professionals that do come and building our communities of color such that there is a landing ground, a place to connect culturally and spiritually, then we are really missing the boat. So.
Wow, that's profound. Yes,
I had
Greg.
A quick comment to that. First of all, she's absolutely right on. Before I left corporate, I started an organization along with the general counsel at PPG, and we identified 22 African-American men and women who were corporate officers. And we created this not to be elitist, but when we decided to do something, we didn't have to go back and ask permission. Today, I left corporate America, quote unquote, retired. he retired from PPG. Today, if we use the same criterion, there are only 4. So in the amount of time that I left corporations and today we lost 4 people of color who are in corporate positions. And so when people do come in from outside and they look around and they don't see leadership that looks like them, then they feel there's no opportunity. And so while I'm open around issues of diversity, I'm going to try to focus my attention on those in the C-suite. When policies are made, they're there. When decisions are going to happen, they're going to be there. And when there's understanding of diverse workforce, they're going to be there and help senior leadership understand the value that's in place.
Wow, excellent.
We're not only we're not only losing people of color, but we're losing all kinds of people. And I think that this is one of the things that I'd like to insert into the conversation about why this is important for Pittsburgh right now. Pittsburgh has an opportunity to lead the nation in terms of how we think about race, class, culture, gender, sexuality. I mean, Latasha talked about intersectionality yesterday. I mean, yes, of course, we can say, and we've seen lots of charts about how Black people are doing relative to everyone else. But this is not a Black problem. It's a Pittsburgh problem. I mean, I think this is where we've got to be clear. And to what Greg shared in terms of, being in the room, I would hope that even if I'm not in the room, that someone's going to say, hey, what about this? Someone's going to ask the question. We've got to be all in on this. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Well, that's a great way to end the panel. How about applause for the great panel? What I would say is I would echo what Dr. Jamil Bey said yesterday. We've got to all take this personally. We've got to all become champions and, understand that enough is enough. It is time to really step it up. It is really time to turn up the heat and work together. We need everyone. We need corporate. We need government. We need nonprofit. We need philanthropy. We need everyone to champion these efforts. And that's what, this moment in time, we shouldn't take it for granted. And I'm excited about the work ahead. I'm excited about the leadership here on the stage and in Pittsburgh. And I just think we've got a lot of challenge, but we've also got a lot of opportunity to reshape this century going into the next decade. So another round of applause for the panel, and we'll. So at this time, we're going to call back to the stage none other than Angela Glover Blackwell to wrap us up. Thank you. Good to see you.
Wow, that was just a fabulous panel. I was so pleased when I came this morning and I saw so many of you here. I must say, when I woke up this morning, I thought, I wonder how many people will come back to have this conversation about all-in, equitable development of just Pittsburgh. And to see so many of you here, to hear this authentic, strong, truthful, searching, effective conversation, and to have you here to see it just makes me so excited about the potential here in Pittsburgh. You all are a very special place, and I hope you know that. I know you have challenges, but to listen to this panel has to give everybody confidence that those challenges, those obstacles are nothing but a thing to be overcome, and you are prepared to overcome it. You know what it is to do equitable development because Derek described it in the most extraordinary way when he talked about in concrete terms what it means to put equity and inclusion at the front of the development process. And he talked about how to really put it in the budget. And Rosa Maria then talked about we're here, there are language issues, there are challenges in terms of understanding and being seen, but common ground is being found, neighbors are being welcoming, and please, don't put us in a silo. We're Steeler fans too. Let us work across the board. And then Marimba talked about the power of resident voice and the need for policy to be able to ingrain the things that are so important to residents into everything that's happening. And Jeannie, very proud of her work in philanthropy, really said that this is a foundation that understands that it's not enough to make the grants. You have to be able to really focus on systems change. They have had the courage, which they are exercising, to actually lead with racial equity, and the humility to be ashamed when they realize how much they're missing of the talent and the skills and the assets in the community and looking to change themselves. Councilmember Lavelle really talked about to change the city, you have to recognize who's being left behind and have the courage to target. It's only by targeting that the resources that you have can produce the best results. To spread everything across in some kind of supposedly even way, and I'm sure some would question whether or not it's even, but to spread in an even way and not to be able to target where there's need is to miss the opportunity to get the most of the resources that are being invested. And Janera helped us to really understand that it is through art that we can develop the deep understanding of who we are, that we can critique our values, that we can begin in a place of identity, and that we must start with art, not add it at the end to put across a beautiful gloss of what it is we've already created, but to start with art, to start with culture, allows us to be able to build what we really need. And do not ever think that art doesn't exist in every community. We don't need to import art, we need to empower art. We need to co-power art, I think is the language I learned yesterday. And then Greg talked about the extraordinary, the phenomenal capacity of business to be able to make a difference. He has seen it being inside. He understands what it means to invest in people, to be able to find the talent that exists, the talent that is needed, and invest in it so that real change can happen, but also to start a business himself and to be able to make it exactly what he saw needed to be done. But he also talked about the power of being in the room. And it's not just in the business, but in the C-suite. To be in the room, to be able to be there when the decisions are being made. And then we were reminded that ultimately when we reach for the best among all of us, we want to know that everybody has everybody else's back. Yes, you want to be in the room, but what we strive for is to know that your interests are covered, whoever's in the room, because we have each other's backs. This has been a conversation that really has taken us from the ideas of equitable development, which I was so proud of my colleague, Sarah Truehalf, as she presented the work that she's been doing with this community. And it is the philosophy of PolicyLink to work with communities. We don't believe in importing anything. We think that the strengths are always there, and what we're doing is working with communities to be able to add what we can to lift it up. But listening to people respond to what she put out, and to hear the authenticity in this conversation showed that equitable development is owned by this community. It's being created by this community. And today really gives me extraordinary confidence that you will achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Last evening, we were joking. I was talking to Angela, and she talked the joke that she made on stage yesterday about the skunk at the picnic. And I guess we're all skunks now, because she brought the conversation that, look, we're missing this equity piece in the first P4, and she came and we brought it this time. I think this panel up here did a tremendous job in setting this stage for what we're about to do.